The Wyoming prairie stretched away in all directions, an ocean of brittle grass turned gold by the dying light of a September afternoon in 1873. Dust hung suspended in the air, caught between earth and sky, and the wind came down from the Absaroka Mountains with the first bite of autumn. It was the kind of wind that spoke of hard times ahead of winter approaching faster than anyone was ready for. Elise Brennan stood beside what remained of her shelter, a ragged canvas pup tent that sagged against its single remaining pole like a drunk leaning on a bar. She was 28 years old, though the past month had added years to her face. Dark hair streaked prematurely gray whipped across her cheeks. Her hands rested protectively on the swell of her belly, 7 months pregnant, and her eyes gray as creek stones, fixed on the figure approaching from the west. He was tall, this man, and unmistakably Lakota. His long black hair was tied back with rawhide, and he wore buckskin that had been mended many times with careful stitches. No rifle hung from his shoulder, just a sheathed knife at his hip and a coil of rope across his back. His hands hung loose at his sides, open and empty in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. Behind Elise, 3 children pressed close. Penny, 7 years old, had soot smudged across her freckled cheeks and a fresh scrape above her eyebrow where the tent pole had clipped her when it snapped that afternoon. John, 9, stood with his thin shoulders squared, trying to look like the man of the family he suddenly was. Amos, barely 5, clutched a dented tin kettle against his chest, like it might protect him from the world. The warrior stopped 20 feet away. In the distance behind him, a buffalo hide teepee stood on the lee side of a red sandstone butte smoke rising from its peak in a straight, steady line. The wind that tore at Elise's tent barely touched the teepee it had been placed with knowledge passed down through generations, positioned to survive what was coming. "You'll be warm tonight," the man said, his English accented but clear. He gestured toward the teepee, toward the buffalo robes, and banked fire that waited there. Elise's hand moved instinctively to her coat pocket where she kept a folding knife, a poor weapon, but the only one she had. The man saw the movement and stopped reading her fear with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime gauging distance and threat. "Storm comes," he continued, nodding toward the western sky, where clouds were massing like dark armies. "Your shelter will not hold." As if to prove his point, another gust tore through the camp. The tent gave a tortured groan, canvas snapping like a whip, and the remaining stake ripped free. The whole structure collapsed in on itself, one corner tumbling end over end into the gathering darkness. Amos made a small, frightened sound. John's face went pale beneath the prairie dirt. Penny began to cry, quiet, hopeless sobs that cut deeper than screams. The warrior shifted his stance, a subtle movement that placed his body between the children and the worst of the wind. It was instinctive, protective, and it reminded Elise of something her husband used to do before a freighter wagon's wheels had crushed the life from him 3 weeks ago. She found herself studying the man's face, weathered by sun and wind, marked by small scars that told stories she would never know, but not cruel. His dark eyes met hers and held steady. There was something in that gaze, a kind of recognition, as if he saw in her a reflection of someone he had lost. "Why?" The word came out hoarse, barely audible over the wind. "Why would you help us?" The warrior was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "I had a sister. She stood as you stand now with children and nowhere to go. No one helped her." The wind howled, driving dust into Elise's eyes. Her children huddled against her legs, trembling with cold and fear. The mountains to the west had disappeared behind the storm clouds, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall cold as melted snow. In that moment, Elise Brennan made a choice that would change everything. She looked at her children's frightened faces, at the ruins of their tent already vanishing into the prairie darkness, at the stranger who offered shelter for reasons she did not fully understand. "All right," she said, and took the first step toward the teepee. Behind them, the wind erased their footprints almost as fast as they made them. And somewhere in the darkness, men with rifles and bad intentions were riding through the storm, checking to see if their warning had been heeded. It had not. 3 weeks and 4 days earlier, September 2nd, 1873 to be precise, Thomas Brennan had died on the rutted track that served as the main road out of Cedar Falls, Wyoming territory. The freight wagon he had been loading for Kincaid's hauling company had been stacked too high, with grain sacks tied too loose and built on a wheel that had been cracked since July. When the wagon lurched into a washout, the load shifted violently. Thomas had tried to jump clear, but his boot caught in the wagon tongue and 3,000 pounds of oak and iron and grain rolled over him before anyone could shout a warning. The driver, a man named Griggs, whom Elise had never seen before and would never see again, had sworn it was an accident. He had sworn it with such vehemence, such detailed conviction, that Elise had known immediately it was rehearsed. Dr. Francis Webb, the town's only physician, had been summoned from his office above the apothecary. He arrived to find Thomas already dead, his chest-crushed blood pooling in the dust. Webb had examined the body with the professional detachment of a man who had seen too much death during the war, and then pronounced what everyone already knew. "Dead on impact," Webb had said, wiping his hands on a cloth that had once been white. He didn't suffer. It was a kindness, perhaps, or perhaps just something doctors said. Elise had not been there to see it happen. She had been at the shanty they rented from massive Mark Kincaid, trying to coax their ancient cook stove into heating water for laundry. She had learned of her husband's death from Bernadette Walsh, the school teacher who had come running with her skirts hiked up and her face pale with shock. They buried Thomas 2 days later in the hard ground behind the Methodist church. The preacher, a thin man with consumption, who would be dead himself before Christmas, spoke about dust and resurrection and the mysterious ways of providence. Elise stood at the graveside in a brown dress she had dyed with walnut hulls until it was almost black. One hand resting on Jan's shoulder, the other on the small of her back, where the baby was just beginning to make its presence known with kicks and rolls. 18 people attended the funeral. Bernadette Walsh was there, of course, and Wilbur Pike, the sodbuster who farmed a quarter section along Sweetwater Creek. Dr. Webb came standing at a respectful distance with his medical bag slung over his shoulder, as if death might call him away at any moment. The rest were homesteaders and townspeople who had known Thomas slightly or not at all, but came anyway because funerals were community obligations on the frontier. Massive Mark Kincaid did not attend. Neither did his foreman Sykes nor Sheriff Blackjack Crow. Their absence was noted and understood. Men like Kincaid did not mourn the deaths of men who worked for wages. The eviction notice arrived 4 days after the funeral. Elise had been sitting at the table, a plank laid across 2 barrels, trying to make sense of the household accounts. Thomas had always handled the money-keeping receipts in a cigar box under their bed. She had found the box and dumped its contents on the table, a few coins, some scraps of paper with numbers scratched in pencil, and a note that said, "Paid in full through September," signed by someone whose handwriting was illegible. The knock on the door had been brisk, businesslike. When Elise opened it, she found Sykes standing on the threshold with a piece of paper in his hand, and 2 riders behind him for enforcement. Sykes was a narrow-faced man, with eyes like chips of flint. He was not cruel by nature, but he was efficient, which was sometimes worse. "Mrs. Brennan," he said not unkindly, "I got a notice here from Mr. Kincaid. Says you're 3 months behind on rent. He wants the property cleared by week's end." Elise had stared at the paper, at the official-looking seal, and the neat columns of numbers that seemed to have been pulled from thin air. That's not possible. Thomas paid every month. He kept receipts. Then I'd advise you to show them receipts to Mr. Kincaid. Sykes said. But till you do, you're in arrears, and he wants you out. My husband just died. I know, ma'am, and I'm sorry for it. But business is business. Elise had searched the shanty with increasing desperation, tearing through Thomas's few possessions, checking under the mattress, emptying the cigar box again and again, as if the receipts might materialize through sheer force of will. But there was nothing. Either Thomas had lost them, or they had never existed, and this was the thought that made her stomach clench. Kincaid had taken them back, covering his tracks in preparation for this exact moment. By September 12th, everything the Brennan family owned that could not be carried was sitting in the yard of the shanty claimed by Kincaid's men for recovery of debt. The bed frame, the cook stove, the table, and barrels, the 3 chairs Thomas had built with his own hands, all of it gone. What remained fit into 2 bundles and a flour sack clothes, a quilt Elise's mother had sewn before cholera took her the dented kettle, a skillet with a cracked handle, Thomas's tent from his Ohio days, and a box of hardtack that was already growing soft with age. They had camped on the open prairie 2 miles west of Cedar Falls on land that belonged to no one and therefore could not be taken. For 9 days, it had been enough. The tent had been whole, the weather had held, and Elise had convinced herself that they could survive until she figured out a plan. Then the wind had come down from the mountains, and the tent pole had snapped. And now she stood in a Lakota teepee, with her children pressed against her sides, listening to the storm tear across the prairie outside, while a stranger fed buffalo chips to the fire and heated water in a copper kettle. The warrior's name was Enape. He told her this while he poured hot water into a tin cup and added herbs from a leather pouch that hung at his belt. The drink was bitter-tasting of sage and something else she could not identify, but it spread warmth through her chest and belly. Drink, he said, handing the cup first to Penny, then to Jan, then to Amos. It will help. The teepee's interior was warm and dry, the buffalo robes thick enough to sleep a dozen people. Enape's uncle sat near the back, an old man with white braids and a face like carved walnut. 2 younger men cousins, Elise guessed, sat nearby, their expressions neutral but not hostile. They spoke to each other in Lakota, voices low, occasionally glancing at the white woman and her children with something that might have been curiosity or might have been resignation. Outside, the storm raged. Rain drummed against the buffalo hide, but the water ran off rather than soaking through. The wind howled, but the teepee stood firm, its lodge poles lashed with knowledge that went back further than Elise could imagine. Sleep now, Enape said, gesturing to the robes. The storm will pass. Elise wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some sense of dignity or independence, but exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. She pulled the buffalo robes around her children and lay down beside them, her hand resting on her swollen belly, where the baby kicked restlessly as if agitated by the storm's violence. Across the fire, Enape sat with his back against a lodgepole, his rifle within arm's reach, but not in his hands. His eyes were half closed, but Elise could tell he was not sleeping. Watching, waiting. She closed her eyes and listened to the storm. Somewhere in the space between waking and sleep, she felt the weight of the past 3 weeks crash down on her, the grief she had not allowed herself to feel, the fear she had kept locked away for her children's sake, the bone-deep weariness of trying to survive with nothing but stubbornness and will. Here, for this one night, she could let go. Just for a little while. When she woke, the storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and cold. Pale dawn light filtered through the teepee's entrance. She sat up carefully, untangling herself from the robes without waking the children, and crawled outside. The prairie stretched away under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air was sharp and clear, carrying the scent of wet sage and distance. And there, 20 yards from the teepee, stood Enepe, his arms folded across his chest, staring at the ground. Elise walked over and stopped. The earth around where her tent had stood was churned to mud. Their few possessions, the kettle, the skillet, the flour sack, were scattered and soaked. But it was not the wreckage that made her blood run cold. It was the hoof prints. At least a dozen horses had circled their camp during the storm, their tracks deep and clear in the soft mud. Fresh tracks made after the rain had stopped. And in the center of the circle, driven deep into the earth, where the tent entrance had been, stood a Bowie knife. Pinned beneath the blade was a scrap of paper. The ink had started to run, but the message was still legible. Written in crude block letters, "Leave the canyon." Last warning. Enepe pulled the knife free and handed Elise the paper. She stared at the words, her mind struggling to process them. "I don't understand. We're not in the canyon. We're nowhere near any canyon. The warning is not for you," Enepe said quietly. "It is for me." He told her then, his voice flat and careful, about his sister Wyanet, about the camp she had made near the mouth of the canyon, where Sweetwater Creek emerged from the rocks, clear and cold and reliable, about the spring that had run there for as long as the people could remember, open to all who needed water, about the dam. 6 weeks earlier, Kincaid's men had built a timber and stone structure across the canyon mouth, diverting the spring's flow south toward Kincaid's grazing lands. The water that had fed a dozen homesteads and provided drink for the Lakota camps simply stopped flowing. The creek bed dried to cracked mud. Crops withered. Animals died. When Wyanet protested, when she stood in front of Kincaid's foreman and demanded that the water be released, one of the men had struck her hard enough to split her lip and leave a bruise that lasted 2 weeks. They had torn down her brush shelter, scattered her possessions, and told her that the spring belonged to Kincaid. Now legal and proper, with papers to prove it. Wyanet had taken her daughters north to the reservation, where the water was thin and alkaline, and the promised government rations arrived sporadically at best. "I went to the sheriff," Enepe said. "I told him what happened. He said the spring was on Kincaid land. He said the paper proved it. He said if I had a problem, I should take it up with the territorial office." "And did you?" "I took it up with Dr. Webb instead." Webb had been treating Enepe for a gash on his forearm, a fall from his horse, nothing serious, but deep enough to need stitching. While he worked, Enepe had told him about Wyanet, about the dam, about Kincaid's claim to the spring. Webb had said nothing until the stitches were done and his hands were washed. Then he had gone to a cabinet and returned with a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. "There's a clerk in the land office," Webb had said. "Maximilian Bode. He's got a conscience, which is a dangerous thing to have in this town. He made this copy because he thought someone should know the truth." Inside the oiled cloth was a single sheet of paper, a page copied from a surveyor's ledger dated 1867. It showed the original boundary markers for the canyon area, with the spring clearly marked as a public watercourse open to all settlers under the doctrine of prior appropriation. Kincaid forged the district map, Webb had explained. Changed the boundary markers, backdated the claim, forged the surveyor's seal. Maximilian knows because he's the one Kincaid forced to do it. But he's too scared to testify. If you want to fight this, you'll need more than a copy. You'll need witnesses. You'll need people willing to stand up in court and say Kincaid's a liar. "Where do I find such people?" Enepe had asked. Webb had smiled grimly. "If I knew that I'd have done it myself years ago." Now standing in the mud with a threatening note in her hand, Elise understood. The riders had come looking for Enepe. They had found him camped with a white woman and her children. And now Kincaid's men believed they were together, allies, conspirators, a problem that needed to be eliminated. They think we're working together? Elise said slowly. Yes. Are we? Enepe looked at her, his dark eyes measuring. That depends. Are you willing to fight? Elise thought about Thomas crushed under a wagon with a wheel Kincaid's quartermaster had signed off as safe. She thought about the eviction notice, the missing receipts, the way Sykes had stood on her threshold and taken everything she had left. She thought about her children, hungry and scared, and the baby growing inside her who would be born into this hard country with nothing but what she could provide. Yes, she said. I'm willing to fight. Then we go to the sheriff, Enepe said. We show him the note. We ask for protection. And when he refuses, and he will refuse, we will know exactly where he stands. And then we find another way. They gathered what they could salvage from the mud, the kettle, the skillet, the flour sack, which had somehow stayed dry. The children woke and ate a quick breakfast of parched corn and water. Enepe's uncle offered his horse a sturdy pinto mare with a calm temperament, and showed Elise how to sit astride and hold the single rein. She had never ridden before. The horse's back felt impossibly high and unstable, and her pregnant belly made it awkward to balance. But she gripped the mane and tried to match her body to the animal's rhythm, while Jan and Penny clung to her waist and Amos rode in a leather sling on Enepe's back. They set out toward Cedar Falls as the sun climbed higher, turning the wet prairie into a landscape of steam and glittering light. Behind them, the teepee stood alone against the sky, and the hoof prints in the mud began to dry and crack. But the knife remained its blade, still damp with morning dew, a promise carved in steel that someone would come to collect. The ride took nearly 2 hours. The prairie rolled away in gentle swells, broken occasionally by sandstone outcrops and dry creek beds that would run full when the snow melted in spring. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals, their shadows racing across the grass. In the distance, antelope grazed their white rumps, flashing, as they bounded away at the sound of hoofbeats. Elise learned quickly that riding was less about strength and more about balance, letting the horse do the work, moving with it rather than against it. Her back ached and her thighs burned, but she clenched her teeth and said nothing. John's arms around her waist were thin and tight, and she could feel him trembling, though whether from cold or fear she could not tell. Enepe rode slightly ahead on his buckskin gelding, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon. He moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback, his body swaying with the animal's gait, reading the land the way Elise might read a book. They were half a mile from Cedar Falls when they reached the Willow Ford, where Sweetwater Creek ran broad and shallow over smooth stones. The water level was noticeably lower than it should have been. Elise could see the exposed roots of the willows, the pale stones that should have been underwater, the dried mud along the banks, marking where the creek had once flowed. Enepe reined in his body, going still. "What is it?" Elise asked, her voice low. "Tracks," he said, pointing. "There and there. Fresh. Made this morning." Elise saw them then, hoof prints in the soft mud at the creek's edge, overlaying each other in a confused pattern that suggested men wading horses shifting restlessly. "How many?" she whispered. "2. Maybe 3. Before she could respond, the first shot cracked across the morning quiet. The bullet struck the water 3 feet from the pinto's front hooves, throwing up a geyser of spray. The mare shied violently, and Elise grabbed for the mane with both hands, her other arm wrapped around her belly. John and Penny screamed. The second shot came before the echo of the first had faded, clipping a willow branch and sending leaves spinning through the air. "Down!" Enepe shouted, wheeling his horse. "Get down now." Elise did not dismount so much as fall, hitting the water hard on her side. John and Penny tumbled after her, and suddenly Enepe was there, pulling them behind a fallen cottonwood log at the creek's edge. The log was old and weathered, its bark peeling away in long strips, but it was thick enough to stop a rifle bullet. The third shot slammed into the wood with a meaty thunk, sending splinters flying. "Stay flat." Enepe said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Do not lift your head." Elise pressed herself against the log, the children beneath her, and tried to breathe. Her heart hammered so hard she thought her ribs might crack. Creek water soaked her dress cold enough to make her gasp. Amos was crying in the sling on Enepe's back, his wails thin and terrified. "2 rifles," Enepe said, his tone analytical. "Winchesters, lever action. They reload every 3 to 4 seconds." He paused, listening. "They are firing from the far bank behind the willows, about 60 yards. Another volley of shots chewed into the log bark and wood chips raining down. Elise pulled Penny closer, feeling the girl's rabbit-fast heartbeat against her own. "When I move, you stay low," Enepe said. "Do not look up. Do not call out. Understand? What are you going to do? Make them think twice." He rose into a crouch, bringing his rifle up in one smooth motion. He counted under his breath, 1, 2, 3, and then fired. The report was deafening, and across the creek someone yelped. A broad-brimmed hat went spinning into the air, carried on the wind. Enepe dropped back behind the log and began reloading with practiced efficiency. Shell in lever down, lever up. 5 seconds. The return fire came in a ragged volley, water churning where bullets struck willows shredding. "Elise," Enepe said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the far bank. "My horse, the saddlebag. There is a Colt revolver. I need it." It took her a moment to process the words. Then she was crawling through the mud toward where the buckskin gelding stood, trembling but holding position, its reins trailing in the water. The saddlebag hung on the near side. Her fingers were slick and numb, but she got the buckle open and found the Colt, a .44 caliber Army model, its walnut grip worn smooth with use. She grabbed it and 6 loose cartridges, then crawled back to the log. Enepe took the revolver and handed her his rifle. "You know how to load this?" "No." He showed her quickly the loading gate on the side, the way the cartridges slid into the cylinder, the way it rotated with each insertion. "Fast as you can. Do not think. Just load." Elise's hands shook, but she forced them steady. Pick up a cartridge, slide it, and turn the cylinder. Again. Again. She could hear the men across the creek shouting to each other, their voices indistinct but urgent. She could hear Jan's ragged breathing beside her, Penny's quiet whimpers, Amos's wails from the sling. "Good," Enepe said. "Now keep your head down." He rose and fired the Colt 3 times in rapid succession. Boom, 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 each shot carefully aimed. There was a crash of breaking brush, and one of the men cursed loudly. Enepe dropped back and began thumbing fresh cartridges into the revolver. His movements as calm as if he were sitting by a fire, instead of crouched behind a log with bullets flying overhead. "They are leaving," he said after a moment. "Or repositioning. I cannot tell which." Elise strained to hear. The shooting had stopped. In the sudden silence, she could make out the sound of horses' hoofbeats, fading to the south, the jingle of tack, the creak of leather. She risked a glance over the log and saw 2 riders disappearing over a low rise, their silhouettes dark against the bright sky. "Gone," Enepe confirmed, standing slowly, the Colt still in his hand. His gaze swept the creek and the willows and the empty prairie beyond, searching for any sign of lingering threat. Elise tried to stand, but her legs would not support her. She had to brace herself against the log, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. John and Penny clung to her, both crying now, and Amos continued to wail from the sling. "Is anyone hurt?" Enepe asked, his eyes moving over them, checking for wounds. "No," Elise managed. "No, I think we're all right." She ran her hands over the children, checking for blood for injuries. "Are you hurt, Jan, Penny, Amos?" They shook their heads, too frightened to speak. Enipe moved to check the horses, running his hands over their legs and flanks, speaking to them in low, soothing Lakota. Both animals had held steady during the shooting, though the pinto was still dancing nervously. He stroked her neck until she calmed. Elise stood on shaking legs and looked at Enipe. Really looked at him. His expression was calm, but there was something fierce in his eyes now. Something hard and unyielding. "Who were they?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Kincaid's men. Warning shots. If they had wanted us dead, we would be dead. Warning shots could have killed my children." "Yes," Enipe said simply. "That is how warnings work here." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elise felt something shift inside her, a cold, clear fury that cut through the fear. These men had shot at her children, had driven a knife into the ground beside their sleeping heads, had taken her home, her husband, her security, and now they wanted to take her life. She looked at Enipe, at this man who had offered her shelter and was now standing between her family and violence, and she made a decision. "We go to the sheriff," she said. "We show him what happened here, and if he won't help us, then we find someone who will." Enipe nodded, once a sharp jerk of his chin. They remounted awkwardly, painfully, and continued toward Cedar Falls. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning chill, and the prairie stretched away in all directions, beautiful and indifferent. Behind them, the bullet holes in the cottonwood log told a story that no one would believe. And ahead in Cedar Falls, Sheriff Blackjack Crow sat behind his desk, counting the money Kincaid paid him every month to look the other way. Cedar Falls clung to existence on the eastern edge of the prairie, a collection of false-fronted buildings arranged along a single rutted street. The saloon anchored the north end, its sign creaking in the constant wind. South of it stood the dry goods store, the land office, the smithy with its constant ringing of hammer on anvil, Dr. Webb's office above the apothecary, and a boarding house that optimistically called itself the Cedar Falls Hotel. Despite having only 4 rooms and a persistent problem with bed bugs. The street was mostly dust in summer, mostly mud in spring, and always crowded with livestock horses tied to hitching rails, chickens pecking in the alleys, the occasional pig rooting through refuse. Boardwalks ran along both sides, warped and uneven, their boards weathered gray by sun and wind. When Elise and Enipe rode in with the children, people stopped what they were doing and stared. A white woman, visibly pregnant with 3 children, and a Lakota warrior. It was the kind of sight that spawned rumors that got turned into gossip, and then into something uglier. Elise felt the weight of their eyes, like physical pressure. She heard the whispers start, saw the way women clutched their children closer, and men let their hands drift toward their guns. She kept her gaze forward and her chin up, but her cheeks burned with shame she had not earned. The sheriff's office was a squat log building near the saloon, its door propped open with a rock to let in the breeze. They dismounted, and Enipe helped Elise down his hand, steady on her arm. John stayed close to his mother's side, one hand resting on the folding knife at his belt, a child's blade barely adequate for whittling. But the gesture made Elise's heart ache. Sheriff Blackjack Crow sat behind a scarred oak desk, his boots propped on one corner, a tin cup of coffee steaming at his elbow. He was a big man, barrel-chested and heavy through the shoulders, with hands like hams and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite with a dull axe. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, and they missed nothing. A silver star was pinned to his vest, polished to a high shine. When Enipe and Elise entered with the children trailing behind, Crow did not bother to take his boots off the desk. He just watched them approach with the lazy attention of a cat watching mice. "Well now," he said, his voice a rumble like distant thunder. "This ought to be interesting." Enepe stepped forward and laid the muddy, crumpled note on the desk. "Riders came to our camp 2 nights ago," he said. "They left this. This morning, 2 men ambushed us at the Willow Ford. They fired on us, on her children." He nodded toward Elise. Crow picked up the note with 2 fingers, as if it might be contaminated, and squinted at the ink-blurred words. "Leave the canyon," he read aloud. "Last warning." He looked up at Enepe. "You camping in the canyon?" "No. We camped near the butte west of town." "Then why's someone warning you about the canyon?" "Because the warning is not about where I camp. It is about the spring, about Kincaid's dam, about the water he stole." Crow's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or calculation. "You got some kind of grievance with Mr. Kincaid. He diverted a public watercourse. He evicted my sister from her camp. He forged boundary markers to claim land that belongs to everyone." Enepe reached inside his shirt and pulled out the oiled cloth bundle. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the surveyor's ledger page. "I have proof." He laid the page on the desk beside the note. Crow glanced at it, his jaw working as if chewing something tough. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "A clerk in the land office gave it to me. Maximilian Bode. He copied it from the original surveyor's ledger." Max Bode. Crow snorted. "That fool's a drunk. Probably forged this himself for a bottle of whiskey." "It is not forged." Enepe said, his voice tight with control. "The surveyor's seal." Crow reached for his coffee cup, picked it up and set it down deliberately on the ledger page. Hot coffee spread across the paper, soaking into the ink, turning the careful notations into bleeding smears. Before Enepe could react, Crow struck a match on the sole of his boot and touched it to the corner of the page. The paper caught with a soft whoosh, flames licking across the surface. Enepe lunged forward, grabbing the page and slapping at the fire with his bare hands. His breath hissed through his teeth as the heat blistered his palm, but he managed to smother most of the flames. What remained was a charred, water-stained ruin. The center burned away completely, the edges curled and black. "Blast," Crow said mildly. "Clumsy of me." Elise stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. "You did that on purpose." Crow looked at her, as if noticing her for the first time. His gaze traveled slowly from her face to her pregnant belly, and back again, and something unpleasant flickered in his expression. "And who might you be, ma'am?" "Elise Brennan. My husband died 3 weeks ago, crushed under one of Kincaid's wagons. Kincaid evicted us from our home, took everything we owned. We've been camping with Enepe because we have nowhere else to go." "Camping with an Indian?" Crow repeated, tasting the words. "That's a bold choice for a respectable widow." "He saved our lives," Elise snapped. "Twice. Once in the storm last night, and again this morning when your employer's men tried to murder us." Crow's face went very still. "Careful, Mrs. Brennan. That's a serious accusation. Could be called slander in a court of law." "It's the truth. Kincaid's men ambushed us at the creek, 2 of them with rifles. If Enepe hadn't been there." "You got proof?" "You're holding the proof, that note. The hoof prints at our camp, the bullet holes in the log at the ford, the fact that we rode in here soaking wet because we had to take cover in the creek while men shot at us." Crow leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. He picked up his coffee cup, took a long, deliberate sip, then set it down. "Sounds to me like you and your friend here are stirring up trouble," he said. "Making accusations you can't back up. Interfering with legitimate business? Maybe you should move on. Head north to the reservation or east to the settlements. Cedar Falls is no place for squatters." We're not squatters, Elise said, her voice rising. We're homesteaders. We have every right to be here. Rights are what the law says they are, Crow replied. And I'm the law in Cedar Falls. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to take those children and get out of my office. And your friend here is going to ride back to his camp, pack up his teepee, and head north where he belongs. Because if I see him in Cedar Falls again, I'll arrest him for vagrancy. And if I see him with you again, Mrs. Brennan, I'll arrest him for something a whole lot worse than vagrancy. Do we understand each other? Elise opened her mouth to argue, but Ennepe's hand closed gently on her elbow. When she looked at him, his face was calm, but his dark eyes blazed with a fury that matched her own. We understand, he said quietly. Come, we are done here. He turned and walked out, and Elise followed her children trailing behind. On the desk, the charred remains of the ledger page continued to smolder, curling into ash and memory. Outside, the street seemed louder and more crowded than before. People pretended not to stare, but Elise could feel their attention like heat on her skin. She wanted to scream at them to make them see what was happening, but she knew it would do no good. In a town where Kincaid owned half the buildings and the sheriff wore his star, justice was a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. They had just reached the horses when a voice called out, "Mrs. Brennan." Elise turned to see Bernadette Walsh hurrying across the street, her skirts hiked up to avoid the mud, a basket on her arm. Bernadette was a thin woman in her mid-30s, with graying hair pinned in a severe bun and intelligent eyes that missed very little. She taught at the one-room schoolhouse on the edge of town, and she had a reputation for being fair and kind, which made her something of an outsider. "Mrs. Brennan," Bernadette said again, slightly breathless. "I heard about your husband. I'm so very sorry." "Thank you," Elise said automatically. Bernadette's gaze moved to Ennepe, taking in his buckskin clothing, his bandaged hand, the rifle slung across his back. Then she looked back at Elise. "Are you all right? You look—" She hesitated, searching for a diplomatic word. "Like you've had a difficult morning." "We were just speaking with the sheriff," Elise said, her tone carefully neutral. "I see." Bernadette's mouth tightened into a thin line, and I'm sure that was tremendously helpful. Despite everything, Elise almost laughed. The sound came out bitter, about as helpful as shouting into the wind. Bernadette glanced around, checking to see who might be listening, and then lowered her voice. "Walk with me, please." They walked to the edge of town, to where the buildings gave way to open prairie and Sweetwater Creek ran in a thin, disappointing trickle through its bed. The children scattered to the water's edge, and Ennepe stood a respectful distance away, giving the women space to talk. Bernadette set her basket down and folded her arms. "I've been tracking the creek levels," she said without preamble. "In a ledger. I've been measuring the depth and flow every week since Kincaid built that dam. And I can tell you, Mrs. Brennan, that the water has dropped by more than half." Elise blinked, surprised. "Why would you do that?" "Because someone needs to. Because Wilbur Pike's crops are dying and the sod busters downstream are hauling water from the river, and Kincaid's cattle are fat and sleek on water that belongs to everyone. Because it's not right, and I'm tired of watching it happen and doing nothing." "Do you have the ledger with you?" "No. I keep it hidden under my bed because I don't want anyone to know what I'm doing. But I'd be willing to show it to a judge, to testify if it came to that." "The sheriff burned our proof," Elise said, gesturing toward Ennepe. "We had a copy of the surveyor's ledger showing that Kincaid forged the boundary markers. Crow destroyed it right in front of us." Bernadette's face hardened. "Of course he did. Kincaid owns him, has for years." "Then what do we do?" Elise heard the desperation in her own voice and hated it. How do we fight a man who owns the law? We go around the law, Bernadette said. We gather testimony, we document everything. And when the circuit judge comes through, he's due in about 2 weeks, we present it all at once. Not to the sheriff, directly to the judge. Will that work? I don't know, Bernadette admitted. But it's better than giving up. They talked for another 15 minutes, making a plan that felt fragile and desperate, but better than nothing. Bernadette would continue her measurements and quietly reach out to other homesteaders gathering their stories. Dr. Webb would write a letter to the territorial governor documenting the suspicious circumstances around Thomas's death and Maximilian Beaudet's fear of reprisal. Enepe and Elise would move their camp closer to Wilbur Pike's land, where there would be more witnesses if Kincaid's men came calling again. It was not much, but it was something. They parted ways, and Enepe and Elise rode back toward the prairie, with the children silent and subdued behind them. The sun was high now, the heat pressing down like a hand. Elise's back ached, the baby kicked incessantly, and exhaustion dragged at her bones. As they crested a low rise, Enepe suddenly reined in. Elise followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. Smoke, thin and gray, rising from the direction of their camp. They kicked the horses into a gallop at the distance, disappearing in a blur of motion. 10 minutes later, they arrived to find the teepee still standing, but the surrounding area ransacked. Food scattered, blankets torn, water skins slashed and empty. And written in the dirt with a stick, the letters crude but clear, "Final warning." Enepe dismounted and walked through the wreckage, his face like carved stone. His uncle and cousins were gone. Their tracks showed they had left on foot, heading north toward the reservation, driven away by the violence. Elise slid from the saddle and stood beside him, her hand resting on her belly. Will they come back? Enepe knelt and studied the hoofprints. 6 riders, maybe more. The tracks were fresh, made within the last hour. Yes, he said, standing. They will come back, and next time it will not be a warning. That night, they did not sleep. They kept the fire low and took turns watching, and every sound in the darkness made Elise's heart leap into her throat. But the riders did not come. It was 2 days later at Wilbur Pike's homestead that the next blow fell. And this time, it came not from Kincaid's men, but from a terrified clerk with a bruised face and a secret that would change everything. Wilbur Pike's quarter section lay along what had once been a reliable stretch of Sweetwater Creek. His soddy was built into a hillside, its roof covered with earth and prairie grass, its single window facing east to catch the morning light. Before the dam, Wilbur's corn had grown tall and green, irrigated by a hand-dug ditch that ran from the creek to his fields. Now the ditch was dry, the corn withered to brown stalks that rattled in the wind like bones. Wilbur himself was a lean, weathered man in his late 40s, with a beard gone gray and hands gnarled from decades of work. When Enepe and Elise arrived with the children, he had welcomed them without hesitation. Kincaid's men ride through here sometimes, he had said. But they're less bold when there's witnesses. You're welcome to camp by the barn. For 2 days, it had been almost peaceful. The children helped Wilbur feed his chickens and collect eggs. Elise mended torn clothes and washed laundry in a bucket. Enepe hunted rabbits in the hills and taught Jan how to set snares using rawhide and bent willow branches. In the evenings, they ate together cornmeal mush and fried rabbit and the last of Wilbur's molasses and talked about weather and crops and the likelihood of an early winter. Then on the morning of September 25th, Maximilian Beaud arrived. He came on foot, stumbling down the wagon track from Cedar Falls in the pre-dawn gray, his coat torn and his face a mass of bruises. Elise saw him first, a dark shape moving erratically through the mist, and she woke Enipe with a hand on his shoulder. They met him at the edge of Wilbur's property, and Maximilian collapsed against the fence rail, gasping for breath. Up close, he looked even worse than Elise had thought. One eye was swollen nearly shut, his lip was split and crusted with dried blood, and his knuckles were scraped raw as if he had tried to fight back. "Water," he croaked. "Please." Elise brought a dipper from the well, and he drank it in great choking gulps. He was a small man, narrow-shouldered and soft-handed, with the pale indoor look of someone who worked with paper and ink. His hands shook as he lowered the dipper. "What happened?" Enipe asked. Maximilian glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting pursuit, then spoke in a rush. "They know. Kincaid and Crow. They know I gave you the ledger copy. I don't know how someone must have seen me with Dr. Webb, or maybe Webb told them. I don't know. But Kincaid came to the land office yesterday evening, waited until everyone else had gone, asked me about the surveyor's records, asked if I'd made any copies." "What did you tell him?" Elise asked. "I lied. Told him no. But he didn't believe me." Maximilian touched his swollen eye gingerly. "His foreman Sykes, he did this. Said if I didn't tell them where the original ledger was, he'd go after my wife. He said..." His voice broke. "He said he'd hurt her. Make an example." Enipe's hand moved to rest on Maximilian's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. "The original ledger. You have it." Maximilian nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again, his movements jerky with fear. "I hid it. Under the floorboards in the telegraph office. I thought it would be safe there. The office is locked at night, and no one goes in except me and the telegraph operator. But Kincaid knows I have something. He knows, and he's planning to burn the office tonight. He'll blame it on..." He glanced at Enipe, his expression guilty. "On Indians, on raiders. And then all the evidence will be gone." Elise felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "You forged the records for him," she said slowly, understanding dawning. "You're the one who changed the boundary markers." Maximilian flinched, as if struck. "He threatened my wife. Said if I didn't alter the maps, if I didn't backdate the claim and forge the surveyor's seal, he would... He covered his face with his hands. I'm a coward. I know I am. But I couldn't let him hurt her. I couldn't." "So you let him steal the spring instead?" Enipe set his voice flat. "Yes," Maximilian whispered. "And now he's going to destroy the only proof that it happened. And it will all be my fault." There was a long silence. The eastern sky was beginning to pale, the stars fading one by one. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote called, and another answered. Wilbur emerged from the soddy rubbing sleep from his eyes. When he saw Maximilian's battered face, he stopped short. "What in blazes?" "Trouble," Enipe said. "The kind that is coming for all of us." They went inside, and by the light of a single candle, Maximilian told them everything. How Kincaid had approached him 6 months earlier with a bottle of whiskey and a stack of bills. How he had redrawn the district map, moving the boundary markers a quarter-mile north to put the spring on Kincaid's land. How he had forged the surveyor's seal using a wax stamp he had made from a clay impression he had taken from an old document. How he had backdated everything to make it look as if the claim had been filed years earlier, before most of the homesteaders had arrived. "The original ledger shows the truth." Maximilian said, his voice hoarse. "The real boundaries, the real dates, Kincaid's signature on the forged documents. If that ledger goes up in flames, no one will ever be able to prove he lied. Then we get the ledger before he burns it," Elise said. Maximilian shook his head. "The telegraph office is locked at night. Crow has the only key, and Kincaid's men will be watching. They'll be expecting someone to try. Then we do not go at night, Enepe said. We go now, before they expect it. That's suicide, Wilbur said. You walk into Cedar Falls in broad daylight and start tearing up floorboards, Crow will shoot you where you stand. Then we create a distraction, Elise said. All eyes turned to her. She took a breath, thinking quickly. Bernadette. She can organize the townspeople. Spread word about a meeting, something about water rights, about the creek levels. Get people asking questions, demanding answers. While everyone's distracted, we get the ledger. Maximilian looked at her with something like hope. You think it could work? I don't know, Elise admitted. But it's better than letting Kincaid win. They spent the next hour planning. Wilbur would ride to Bernadette's, explain the situation. Bernadette would spread word of a midday meeting at the schoolhouse, a public discussion about water rights and Kincaid's dam. It was a thin excuse, but it might be enough to draw a crowd and keep Crow occupied. Meanwhile, Enepe and Elise would go to the telegraph office. Maximilian would guide them to the hiding place. They would retrieve the ledger, and they would get out before anyone noticed. It was desperate and full of holes. But desperation was all they had. They set out at mid-morning, taking the back routes and alleys to avoid the main street. Maximilian led them with his head down and his shoulders hunched, jumping at every sound. Elise kept the children close, and Enepe walked with one hand on his knife. The telegraph office was a narrow building wedged between the land office and the blacksmith's forge. Its single window was shuttered, and the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Maximilian produced a key he had kept to spare for emergencies, and they slipped inside. The interior smelled of dust and machine oil. A desk stood against one wall, cluttered with telegraph equipment and stacks of forms. The floorboards were rough pine, unfinished and warped with age. Maximilian knelt near the far corner and began prying up boards with a bent nail he pulled from his pocket. Here, he whispered. It's right here. He lifted 3 boards in quick succession, revealing a shallow space beneath. Nestled in the dirt was a tin box, its lid secured with a length of wire. Maximilian lifted it out with trembling hands and set it on the floor. Inside were papers, surveyor's notes, boundary maps, and the original ledger, its leather cover worn smooth with age. Maximilian opened the ledger to a page near the middle and pointed with a shaking finger. There, he said. That's the entry for the Canyon Spring, public watercourse, open to all under prior appropriation doctrine, signed and sealed by the territorial surveyor, March 1867. Enepe leaned in, studying the page. The handwriting was neat and careful, the seal impressed deep into the paper. This is proof. It's proof that Kincaid lied, Maximilian said. Proof that the spring belongs to everyone. Elise reached for the ledger, but before her fingers could close on it, the door slammed open with a crash that made everyone jump. Roaring Jack Dillard filled the doorway, his Spencer carbine leveled at Enepe's chest. Behind him, 3 of Kincaid's riders crowded in, their faces hard and hungry. Well now, Jack said, his scarred jaw twisting into something that might have been a smile. What do we have here? Enepe's hand moved toward his knife, but Jack cocked the carbine with a loud metallic click. Don't, he said. I'm getting paid either way, but I'd rather not scrub brains off the wall. Maximilian lunged for the ledger, but one of the riders grabbed him by the collar and hauled him back, slamming him against the wall. The tin box tipped, and the ledger tumbled out, its pages scattering across the floor. Elise dove for it, but Jack stepped forward and kicked it aside, sending it skittering toward the far corner. Several pages tore free, fluttering like injured birds. Sykes told me to keep an eye on the clerk. Jack said conversationally. Told me he'd try something foolish. Sure enough, here you all are. You work for Kincaid. Enepe said, his voice cold. I work for whoever pays. Right now, that's Kincaid. Jack shifted the carbine slightly. Now here's how this plays out. You're going to stand up nice and slow and walk out that door. The ledger stays, the clerk stays, and if I see you in Cedar Falls again, I collect my $50. Dead or alive makes no difference to me. You cannot, Elise started, but Jack cut her off. I can and I will. Now move. Enepe held Jack's gaze for a long, tense moment. Then slowly he stood, his hands spread wide to show they were empty. Elise rose as well, pulling Penny and Jan to their feet. Amos clung to her skirt, his face buried in the fabric. They walked toward the door, forced to pass within inches of Jack and his carbine. As they crossed the threshold, Elise looked back at Maximilian, at the terror in his eyes and the resignation of a man who had gambled everything and lost. I'm sorry, he whispered. Outside, the street was busy with midday traffic. People moved about their business, unaware or uncaring of what had just happened. Enepe and Elise walked quickly toward the edge of town, not speaking, not looking back. Behind them, they heard the sound of the door slamming shut and the scrape of a bar being dropped into place. What do we do now? Elise asked, her voice hollow. Enepe's face was hard, his jaw set. We do not give up. They have the ledger. They have a ledger, Enepe corrected. But Maximilian knows what it says. He can testify. If they let him live. Then we make sure they do not have a choice. But even as he said it, Elise could hear the doubt in his voice. They had been outmaneuvered at every turn. Kincaid was too powerful, too wealthy, too well-connected. Fighting him was like trying to hold back the prairie wind with bare hands. That evening, they returned to Wilbur's homestead and told him what had happened. He listened in grim silence and then shook his head. You can't fight him head-on, not with the law on his side, not with guns. Then how? Elise demanded. How do we stop him? Wilbur was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, we hit him where it hurts. We take away his advantage. That dam is the source of his power. Without it, he's just another cattle baron with too much land and not enough water. Enepe looked up sharply. You mean destroy it? I mean open the floodgates. Release the water. Let it flow the way it's supposed to. That would be illegal, Elise said. So is forging land claims and murdering homesteaders, Wilbur replied. Sometimes you have to break a bad law to make room for a good one. It was sedition pure and simple. But as Elise sat there in the candlelight, listening to the wind howl across the prairie, she found herself nodding. All right, she said. Then that's what we do. And somewhere in the darkness, Kincaid's men were saddling their horses, preparing to deliver a message that would leave no room for misunderstanding. The attack came at dawn on September 27th, when the world was caught between darkness and light. The sky streaked with pale orange, and the air cold enough to sting the lungs. Elise woke to the thunder of hoofbeats, not the casual clip-clop of a single horse, but the drumming rumble of many moving fast with intent. Up! Enepe's voice cut through her grogginess. He was already moving, pulling his rifle from its case. Get the children inside the soddy now. Elise scrambled from her bedroll, her pregnant belly making her movements clumsy. She grabbed Amos by the arm. John Penny, move! The children stumbled after her, still foggy with sleep. Wilbur was already at the soddy door with his shotgun, his face grim in the pre-dawn light. He waved them inside, and Elise pushed the children through ahead of her. 6 riders came pounding down the track from Cedar Falls, their horses stretched out in a full gallop, dust rising behind them like smoke. Even at a distance, Elise recognized Sykes riding at the front, his narrow face set with determination. Behind him came 5 others, hired guns with rifles, and the kind of cold purpose that came from being paid to hurt people. Enipe crouched behind a water trough near the barn, his rifle braced across the top. "Wilbur, get inside and bar the door." "This is my land," Wilbur shouted. "I'll not hide in my own home." "Then take the east window and cover the barn." The riders opened fire while still 100 yards out, their bullets kicking up dirt and splintering wood. Enipe returned fire, his shot carefully aimed. One of the horses screamed and went down hard, throwing its rider into the dirt. The man rolled and came up running, diving behind a fence post. Elise ran back toward the soddy, but Enipe's voice stopped her. "The Colt, I need the Colt." She grabbed the revolver from where it lay with their gear and ran to the water trough in a low crouch, bullets whining overhead. She dropped beside Enipe, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. "Load for me," he said, passing her the rifle without taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "Fast as you can." Her hands shook, but she forced them steady. Cartridge and lever down, lever up. Again, again. She could hear her own ragged breathing and the thunder of hoofbeats, the crack of rifle fire. Enipe took the rifle back and fired 3 times in rapid succession. One shot caught a rider in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in the saddle. Another clipped a horse, and the animal bucked wildly, dumping its rider. But there were still 4 men coming, spreading out now, flanking. Sykes dismounted and took cover behind a wagon wheel near the barn, his rifle trained on the soddy. "Brennan!" he yelled, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "You got 30 seconds to come out or we burn you out." "Go to blazes!" Elise shouted back, surprising herself. Sykes laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Have it your way, lady." One of the riders produced a torch, a length of wood, wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. He struck a match, and the flame caught with a whoosh, bright and hungry in the gray dawn. He spurred his horse toward the barn. Wilbur leaned out the east window and fired. The shotgun's roar was deafening. The rider jerked backward as if yanked by invisible strings, and he toppled from the saddle. The torch fell from his hand, still burning, and rolled across the dirt. But another rider was already moving, circling toward the soddy's blind side. Enipe shifted to track him, but the angle was wrong. The rider threw something, a bottle with a rag, stuffed in its neck, flames licking along the cloth. It arced through the air and smashed against the soddy's earthen wall. The bottle shattered, and fire bloomed across the dry grass of the roof. Inside the soddy, the children screamed. Elise tried to run for the door, but Enipe caught her arm. "Wait. If you open that door now, or they will shoot you. My children are inside. And they will be safer if you stay alive to protect them." He was right, and she hated him for it. She turned back to the trough and fired the Colt toward the riders, the recoil slamming into her wrist. She did not aim. She just pulled the trigger again and again, trying to force them back to buy time. Smoke began pouring from the soddy's roof, thick and black. Wilbur kicked the door open and emerged, coughing, Penny under one arm and Jan under the other. Amos clinging to his back like a burr. He ran for the creek, keeping low bullets chewing the ground at his heels. He reached the shelter of the cottonwoods and dumped the children into the shallow water, shouting at them to stay down. Elise felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of terror unwinding just slightly. They were out. They were alive. But the soddy was burning now, flames climbing the walls, smoke roiling into the sky. And Sykes was advancing, his rifle up his face, set in a mask of cold determination. Enipe rose to fire, but the hammer fell on an empty chamber. He swore and reached for more cartridges, but Sykes was faster. He leveled his rifle at Ennepe's chest and grinned. "End of the line, Redskin." The shot came from the creek, a deep boom that echoed across the prairie. Wilbur had circled back through the willows with his shotgun reloaded, and now he fired from 20 yards away. The blast caught Sykes in the side, spinning him like a child's toy. He went down hard, his rifle clattering away, blood soaking the dust. The remaining riders broke. One shouted, "This ain't worth dying for," and they wheeled their horses and galloped back toward Cedar Falls, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of flames and the ragged breathing of the survivors. Ennepe stood slowly, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He walked to where Sykes lay in the dirt, kicked the rifle away, and looked down at the dying man. "Tell Kincaid," Ennepe said, his voice like iron, "that we are not leaving." Sykes tried to say something, but it came out as a wet cough, blood flecking his lips. His eyes rolled back, and he went still. Elise ran to the creek on legs that felt like water. The children were huddled in the shallows, soaked and shivering, but alive. She pulled them to her, wrapping her arms around them, feeling their hearts beat wild and fast against her own. "It's all right," she whispered, though it was not. "It's all right. We're safe now." But they were not safe. The soddy was a smoking ruin. The yard was littered with bodies and spent brass. And somewhere in Cedar Falls, Kincaid was learning that his men had failed again. He would not fail next time. That afternoon, Dr. Francis Webb arrived with his medical bag and a wagon to carry away the wounded. He treated Wilbur's minor burns and checked Elise and the children for injuries. When he was done, he pulled Ennepe aside, his expression troubled. "Maximilian Bode is dead," he said quietly. "They found him this morning in the creek downstream from the telegraph office. Drowned, they're saying, but his hands were tied behind his back." Ennepe's face did not change, but his eyes went very dark. "And the ledger?" "Gone. The telegraph office burned last night. Crow says it was an accident, a lamp knocked over, but everyone knows the truth. Kincaid erased the evidence." Elise closed her eyes, feeling the weight of failure settle over her like a shroud. Maximilian had died for that ledger, and now it was ash. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice hollow. Webb looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time she saw something like desperation in his face. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever you do, do it soon. Because Kincaid's not going to stop until you're all dead or gone." That night they buried Sykes and the other dead riders in shallow graves on Wilbur's land. No one said words over them. They were just bodies, obstacles removed. Elise sat by the creek with her children and watched the sun set. The sky was bruised purple streaked with red, and the air smelled of smoke and blood and the distant promise of snow. Ennepe came and sat beside her close enough that their shoulders almost touched. His bandaged hand, burned again this time by a smoldering timber, rested on his knee. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "For what? For bringing you into this." "You didn't," Elise said. "Kincaid did. You just offered shelter when no one else would." They sat in silence, watching the light fade. And when the darkness finally came, they did not light a fire. They just sat together, two people who had lost nearly everything and were still trying to hold on. Because holding on was all they had left. But beneath that resignation, something else was growing, a cold, clear fury that would not be denied. Kincaid had taken her husband, her home, her security. He had shot at her children. He had murdered a frightened clerk and burned the evidence of his crimes. Tomorrow, Elise decided they would hit back. Not with guns, but with water. They would open Kincaid's dam and let the spring flow free, and if that made them criminals, so be it. Some laws deserve to be broken. The plan came together with the desperate clarity of people who had nothing left to lose. Bernadette would organize a bucket line in Cedar Falls under the pretense of fire prevention. She would spread word that Kincaid's men might torch more buildings, and the townspeople needed to be ready. It would draw a crowd, create witnesses, keep Crow and his deputies occupied. Meanwhile, Ennepe would ride to the dam. The floodgates were held shut by a massive iron spike driven through a wooden hasp. If he could knock that spike loose, the pressure behind the dam would do the rest. The gates would swing open. The water would pour through, and Kincaid's stranglehold on the spring would be broken. It was not a perfect plan. If they were caught, they would be arrested or more likely shot. But perfection was a luxury they could not afford. They set out on the evening of September 29th, 2 days after the attack on Wilbur's homestead. The sun hung low on the western horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The air was cool, carrying the first real bite of autumn, and the wind whispered through the dry grass like a promise or a threat. Elise rode with Wilbur toward Cedar Falls, her children safe in Bernadette's care at the schoolhouse. Ennepe rode alone toward the canyon, his rifle slung across his back, his jaw set with determination. They did not speak much. There was nothing left to say. Cedar Falls was bustling when Elise and Wilbur arrived. Bernadette had done her work well. Townspeople lined the street with buckets and shovels organized into teams discussing strategy. Dr. Webb moved among them, offering advice. Even the shopkeepers had joined their stores temporarily closed. Elise scanned the crowd and spotted Sheriff Crow standing outside his office, arms folded, expression sour. He clearly did not like this sudden outbreak of civic organization, but there were too many witnesses for him to shut it down. "It's working," Wilbur murmured. "They're distracted." Elise nodded, but her thoughts were with Ennepe, riding alone toward the dam where Kincaid's men might be waiting. 2 miles south, Ennepe reached the canyon mouth as the sun touched the horizon. The dam rose before him, a crude but effective wall of timber and stone, maybe 20 feet high, blocking the narrow passage where Sweetwater Creek emerged from the rocks. Water pooled behind it, dark and still held captive. The floodgates were at the top, heavy timber doors secured with an iron spike as thick as Ennepe's wrist. He would have to climb the dam's face, work the spike loose, and get clear before the water came crashing through. He tethered his horse to a cottonwood and began to climb. The stones were slick with moss and spray, and the gaps between them were treacherous. He moved carefully, testing each handhold, his injured palm throbbing with every grip. The sun dropped lower, and shadows filled the canyon, making it harder to see. He was halfway up when he heard the hoofbeats. Riders, coming fast from the south. Ennepe froze, pressed flat against the stone, and counted. 6 horses, maybe 7. Too many to fight, especially from this exposed position. He climbed faster, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his injured hand screaming in protest. He reached the top just as the riders emerged from the cottonwoods, Kincaid's men heavily armed, spreading out to surround the dam's base. And at their head rode roaring Jack Dillard, his Spencer carbine gleaming in the dying light. "Well, well," Jack called up, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Looks like I found me $50. Ennepe did not waste breath responding. He pulled his knife and began working at the spike, sawing at the wood around it, trying to loosen it. The wood was green and tough, and the spike had been driven deep. The first bullet struck the stone a foot from his head, throwing chips into his face. He flinched, but did not stop. Another shot closer this time. Jack was a good marksman, and the range was getting easier. Ennepe abandoned the knife and grabbed the spike with both hands. He braced his feet against the stone and pulled with everything he had. The spike did not move. Below, Jack dismounted and took careful aim. "Nothing personal," he shouted. "Just business." The shot rang out, and Enipe felt a white-hot punch of pain in his left shoulder. His grip slipped, and he nearly fell. But he caught himself on the timber frame. Blood soaked through his shirt, warm and slick. He pulled again, one-handed now, his vision graying at the edges. The spike shifted just a fraction, just an inch. He pulled harder, feeling something tear in his shoulder. Feeling the world start to spin, the spike came free. The floodgates swung open with a groan, like the earth itself splitting, and the water behind the dam roared to life. It came in a torrent, white and furious, pouring through the opening with a force that shook the ground. Enipe tried to hold on, but the sudden movement of the gates threw him off balance. He fell tumbling down the face of the dam, hitting stone and timber, the world spinning in a chaos of pain and water and sound. He struck the rock apron at the dam's base and lay there, gasping blood, pooling beneath him. The water thundered overhead, drowning out all other sound. Through the roar, he heard Jack's voice. Blast, he opened it. And then another voice, one he had not expected. Enipe Elise. She had left Cedar Falls when the bucket line was organized, unable to stay away, needing to be here. Wilbur had tried to stop her, but she had taken one of the horses and ridden hard for the canyon. Now she slid from the saddle and ran to where Enipe lay, dropping to her knees beside him. His face was pale, his breath shallow, blood soaking through his shirt at an alarming rate. "No," she whispered, pressing her hands against the wound. "No, no, no. Stay with me. Enipe, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "The gate," he rasped. "Did I? You did it. You opened it. The water's flowing." He managed a weak smile. "Good." Jack appeared above them, his carbine leveled at Elise's head. "Ma'am, you need to step away from him." "No, I'm not asking." Elise looked up at him, her hands slick with Enipe's blood, and something in her face made Jack hesitate. "Then shoot me too," she said, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her chest. "Shoot a pregnant woman in front of witnesses. See how that plays in court." Jack glanced around. Wilbur had arrived along with 3 homesteaders who had followed from town. They stood at a distance, watching, bearing witness. "Hell," Jack muttered. He lowered the carbine. "I don't get paid enough for this." Behind him, the water continued to pour through the gates, carving a new channel through the canyon, washing away months of lies and theft. The dam's shuttered stones beginning to dislodge, and Jack's men scrambled to get clear. Elise cradled Enipe's head in her lap, her tears mixing with the spray from the released water. "Don't you dare die," she whispered. "Don't you dare leave me now." "Not planning to," he managed. Dr. Webb arrived, then summoned by Wilbur, and he knelt beside them with his medical bag. His hands moved quickly, efficiently, probing the wound, packing it with clean cloth. "He's alive," Webb said. "But we need to get him to town. Now." They made a stretcher from cottonwood branches and Wilbur's coat, and they carried Enipe back to Cedar Falls as the sun set, and the first stars appeared overhead. The water of Sweetwater Creek flowed beside them, clear and cold and free for the first time in months. Behind them, Kincaid's dam began to collapse, timber and stone, tumbling into the canyon, swept away by the very water it had tried to hold captive. And in Cedar Falls, word was spreading that something had changed, that the balance of power had shifted, that maybe justice was still possible on the frontier. The circuit judge arrived 3 days later, a gray-haired man named Thaddeus Cornwall, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the weary demeanor of someone who had presided over every kind of frontier dispute imaginable. He set up court in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold the crowd that gathered, and spent 6 hours listening to testimony. Bernadette presented her water measurements, a meticulous record spanning 4 months, showing the dramatic decline in creek flow after Kincaid's dam was built. Dr. Webb read his letter to the territorial governor detailing suspicious deaths and destroyed evidence. Wilbur Pike testified about his dying crops, and a dozen other homesteaders did the same, their voices steady despite the presence of Kincaid and his remaining men at the back of the room. Then came the surprise that changed everything. Among the documents Dr. Webb had quietly gathered, not from the burned telegraph office, but from a source he had cultivated carefully over months, was a maintenance log from Kincaid's freight company. It showed that the wagon that had killed Thomas Brennan had been flagged for repair 3 times, its cracked wheel noted as dangerous and unfit for heavy loads. The quartermaster had signed off on it anyway, with a notation that made Elise's blood run cold. Per MK instruction wagon, adequate for low-priority runs. MK. Massive Mark Kincaid. Webb stood and addressed the court, his voice carrying to every corner. Your Honor, this log shows that Mr. Kincaid was personally aware that the wagon was unsafe. He ordered it used anyway for what he deemed low-priority work. Thomas Brennan was killed because Kincaid valued saving money over human life. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Judge Cornwall banged his gavel for silence. Where did you get this document, Dr. Webb? From Griggs, the driver. He approached me 2 days ago, terrified, saying he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Kincaid had paid him to keep quiet, but after hearing about Maximilian Bode's murder, he broke. Webb pulled out another paper. This is Griggs's signed confession. He states that Kincaid ordered him to use the defective wagon for Thomas Brennan's last haul, knowing it might fail. When it did, Griggs was instructed to call it an accident. Elise felt the courtroom spin. It had not been an accident. Thomas had been murdered deliberately coldly to create the pretext for evicting his family and seizing their property. Kincaid surged to his feet. That's a damned lie. I never... Sit down, Mr. Kincaid. Judge Cornwall said, his voice like granite. Or I'll have you removed. The judge reviewed the documents in silence, his expression growing darker. Finally, he looked up. The evidence presented indicates a pattern of fraud, intimidation, and, if this testimony is accurate, premeditated, negligent homicide. Mr. Kincaid, you are hereby ordered to dismantle the remainder of your dam and restore natural water flow to Sweetwater Creek. You will pay damages to the affected homesteaders, amount to be determined by a neutral assessor. Additionally, you will face charges of fraud, obstruction of justice, and negligent homicide to be tried at the territorial court. He paused, letting the words sink in. And, given the severity of these charges and the risk of flight, you will be held in custody pending trial. 2 deputies stepped forward and placed Kincaid in irons. As they led him away, he turned and locked eyes with Elise, his face twisted with impotent rage. This isn't over, he snarled. Judge Cornwall's gavel came down like a gunshot. Yes, Mr. Kincaid, it is. The courtroom erupted in applause. Bernadette hugged Elise so hard she could barely breathe. Wilbur shook hands with the other homesteaders, grinning for the first time in months. Dr. Webb stood quietly in the corner, looking exhausted but satisfied. And in the boarding house, where Enepe was recovering, his shoulder bandaged and his fever finally broken, he heard the cheers from the street and knew they had won. 2 weeks later, after the snows had started and the prairie had turned white, Elise stood with Enepe by the creek and watched the water flow. Clear and cold and free, just as it was meant to be. The cabin they had built was small, but sturdy timber salvaged from the ruined dam stones pulled from the creek bed, a roof of sod and salvaged canvas. It was not much, but it was theirs. Inside, the potbelly stove, purchased with damages from Kincaid's estate, glowed warm and red. John and Penny were doing lessons at a table Wilbur had built. Amos played with a carved horse Enepe had made him. And in a cradle by the fire, wrapped in a buffalo robe, baby Hope slept peacefully. Hard winter coming. Enepe set his arm, still in a sling, but healing well. "We'll meet it," Elise replied. He placed his good hand over hers on the cabin's doorframe. "This roof holds if we brace together." It was not a proposal in the traditional sense. It was something better, a promise of partnership, of shared burdens, and shared hope of facing the hard country together. Elise nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Together. The wind blew down from the mountains, carrying the scent of snow and pine and possibility. The prairie stretched away in all directions, white and clean and new. And in Cedar Falls, the word had spread, and Kincaid's trial would be held in February, and Griggs's testimony had been corroborated by records Webb had found hidden in the freight company's office. Justice, it seemed, was not just possible, but inevitable. Spring would come eventually. The snow would melt, the creek would run high, and Wilbur's fields would turn green again. Children would return to Bernadette's school. The town would rebuild. And here, in a small cabin by the free-flowing creek, a family would grow, bound not by blood alone, but by the kind of partnership that could only be forged in fire and ice, and the unforgiving beauty of the frontier. Elise looked at Enepe, at this man who had offered warmth on the coldest night of her life, and had stood beside her through everything that followed. She thought of Thomas gone, but not forgotten, and she thought of the future taking shape inside her and around her. "We made it," she said softly. Enepe's hand tightened on hers. "Yes, we made it." And as the first stars appeared in the winter sky, they went inside where the fire burned warm and the roof held strong, and hope, small but stubborn, flickered like a candle that refused to be blown out. Deputies led Kincaid away in irons. Outside, Sweetwater ran clear past the saloon steps. Elise pressed Enepe's hand as the town fell quiet, the water speaking louder than any verdict.